So this Defeating Adventism video was only made possible through a suggestion from a friend. So this hat tip here goes to a former Adventist medical doctor out of the state of Ohio who gave me a suggestion, and his suggestion was this. His suggestion was read this book. This is a Seventh-day Adventist book called The Dangers of Contemplative Prayer. He had read this book and was surprised and delighted to read a book by an Adventist that was, well, actually showing some discernment and which was accurate. That's rare in Adventism. I can't underestimate how rare that is in Adventism. Now, from all appearances, the author of this book, what he did was he reported on this non-Christian phenomenon. Emphasis on non-Christian, and he is correct. This non-Christian phenomenon called contemplative prayer, and that he did so in a true and even apologetical sense, which again is really rare for Adventism. I'm like, what's wrong with this guy? This guy's he's got to have 1 foot out of the camp. 1 foot in the camp. I still suspect that he has 1 foot out. I tried to find him. He retired. He moved to San Diego, and then from there he moved to, I forget, Virginia, Maryland, somewhere back east. Now, he's probably by now in his late 80s. I would love to contact him and ask him some things. But anyway. So my former Adventist friend that I mentioned the hat tip to said, hey, you got to read this book. You're actually going to read a book that you think is going to be okay. And I went, no, not an Adventist book. And he said, yeah, read it. I said, okay, I'll read the book. So I took his advice, read the book, which you can see here. Again, it's the very same book that I held up. Let me say this about the book. These two books look the same, but they're not. See, this is the one I read. I think, yeah, this is the one I read, because I got all kinds of notes and underlines in there. And so you're going to see here in a minute, I took photographs. I wanted to take photographs of this book. So what I did was I ordered another copy, a clean one. And then I started noticing the content had shifted a page in some cases. I'm like, oh, they don't tell you this is a second edition. What did you guys do? Anyway, what I found out what they did was there was a table presented in this book that spilled off and was cut in the middle on 2 pages. I think they adjusted for it here. So I don't find any content changes, but the page numbers may not match up. I say all this to say that if you check me, and you should, and you go, hey, you said it was on page 88, it's on page 89, you might have the updated book. And I might have been on probably citing the original book. So keep in mind, two different books. Now, I am already familiar with the topic here of the author, which is contemplative prayer. So it was easy for me to read his book and understand what he's saying is either correct or not correct. Topic I'm already familiar with. But this author's, his history of contemplative prayer, his definition of it, and calling out these practitioners of contemplative prayer were accurate. And I appreciate him for calling out these false teachers. Thank you, Mr. Adventist. I got to mention his name. Howard Peth. Thank you. There it is on the back cover. Thank you, Howard, for calling out these false teachers. Good job. I'm going to end up keeping this book as a reference for the false teachers and all of them that he cites. Now, this book is small. It's only 98 pages. But in 98 pages, he has 239 footnotes. Wow. So I can look at some false teacher and he'll cite from their book, go, here's the book, there it is, go on that page. It's like wonderful. You know, that's an excellent resource. But I want to say this, I can't recommend this book to the Christian community. So I won't recommend it to the Christian community because his Adventism comes out through the pages. And he tells us that here. But this book still stands as unique in the books that I've read and articles about Adventism. I've read many books, watched many videos with Adventists on them, engaged hundreds of Adventists online. And engaging and reading Adventist literature is nauseous and frustrating. Adventists and Adventism cannot think rationally, logically, etc. And I don't expect them to because they're not believers. But this guy is different. So Adventist books, like I said, they're usually poorly written. They're disjointed. The title doesn't even match the content. I covered that in the Green Cord video that I did. It's like, oh great, I get to read a book about the Green Cord. It's like, no, it was almost some kind of pop psychology, stupid nonsense. This book actually has content that matches the title. Ugh. So he exposes a wide variety of contemplative prayer and its derivatives of contemplative prayer, such as Catholic mystics, Quaker mystics, purveyors of Pantheism, Beth Moore, Rick Warren, Robert Schuller, etc., etc., etc. Some of those names you may already know, some of them you don't know. But he exposes them and many more. I only mentioned just a few. So now here's what I want to do. I want to show you just a sampling of the contemplative prayer advocates he exposes in this book, and let's see what he does. So let's start here with Basil Pennington, a Trappist Catholic monk. Look at his accomplishments. Centering prayer originated in this abbey of, other Trappist monks. And then he goes on to quote, our author does here, a book by Basil Pennington, that we have been instructed in the Eastern technique. That's just Hinduism. Trappist monk Basil Pennington did what? Centering prayer. That's what he's known for. It's the age-old, it's another name for contemplative prayer. I did not know what a Trappist monk was. I had to look and see what a Trappist monk was. So if you already know, sorry. If you don't, then you're like me and I had to figure it out. So it's a Reformed branch, Roman Catholics, in France, founded 1660s. It's got both monks and nuns. And I guess the why they're called Trappists is because, they generate income. They produce goods. And they're really known for making beer. Okay. Anyway, so there's our mystic Trappist monk. Let's move on to the next one here. Henry Nouwen. And he too, I'm not going to break this down here so you can see it clearer with me. And look, another Catholic theologian and a mystic. And he's a very popular author, academic, taught at Notre Dame, Harvard, Yale. He is so famous that mega church, false Christian church, which I think Saddleback Church by Rick Warren is that, referred to one of his books and his websites. Rick Warren likes the guy. And look what our author does. He quotes one of his books and says, it's a movement from the moral to the mystical. Here we are. Contemplative prayer, mystic, Catholic, and so on. Let's do this next one. Another Catholic. Do you see a trend here, by the way? So here's another Catholic. Let's just blow up the pages and look at him. Who is he? Well, he's former. He authored a really popular title called The Ragamuffin Gospel. Not a good book. This guy's some problems. He was treated for alcoholism. He left the Franciscan Order of the Catholics in 1982. Got married. Wound up in a divorce. Here's what our Adventist author says regarding Brian Manning and his Another Gospel. Read what this guy says about the atonement. This is blasphemous. This is as blasphemous as what Adventist says about the atonement. Anyway, let me quote here. The God whose moods alternate between gracious and fierce anger, the God who exacts the last drop of blood from his Son so that his just anger, evoked by sin, may be appeased, is not the God revealed by and in Jesus Christ. And if he is not God, Jesus, then he does not exist. This guy has a wrong view of the atonement. This guy has an angry view of the atonement and completely wrong. So I would say, this guy, you don't get the atonement right, you're not Christian. Well, that's Adventism too. So Adventist and this former Catholic are in the same field here. Then he goes on to say his admirers include popular Christian singers such as Amy Grant, Michael Card, and other Christian authors, Max Lucado and Philip Yancey. This is just a list of those that are lacking discernment. And then this is a very interesting thing. Christianity Today called Manning's book The Ragamuffin Gospel. It's a classic, it's a great book. No, it's not. But yet, after they published the article, and the article was called A Coward Who Stayed, which was Manning's story of his alleged heroics assisting victims during Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, they had to publish a retraction 5 days later of their article stating that Manning had lied. In a voice message to Christianity Today, he just called them up and said, I lied. I didn't stay and help anybody. This guy's quite a character. Let's move on to the next one, Tilden Edwards. Now we got an Episcopal priest. He's a co-founder of one of America's largest centers for contemplative prayer. He explicitly admits that this mystical stream, contemplative prayer, it's the Western bridge to Easternism. It's the Western bridge to
Hinduism. And yet he calls himself an Episcopal priest. Let's go to the next one here. This guy here is really popular, and our author had a lot to say about him. He wrote a book, Celebration of Disciple, 1,000,000 copies, one of the top 10 books of the century, and he promotes his baby of, there it is, contemplative prayer, mysticism. He is known as the father of the mystical movement. Let's keep reading because we've got a few pages on this guy. He is a Quaker, born and raised in a Quaker home. So our author delves into Quakers. I have this book that he's quoting here, by the way, the Harper's Encyclopedia of Mystical Paranormal Experience, and I read this quote, which he got from that book. Actually, the book is sitting right here on the desk in front of me, so it's an accurate quote by him, that Quaker theology stresses a personal, almost mystical knowledge of God and the inner light that's within all people. I have a book in my library from the late 1600s written against the Quakers, which I picked up because it was an intriguing title. But when I read this in this book here, I went and got my book from the 1600s, and I read the first chapter, which was critical of Quakers, and guess what it was on? It was on this. It was on Quakers are not Christian because they don't rely on the Word of God. They all sit around and rely on this inner light, this inner mystical feeling that they get. See, Quakers, the worshipers, they don't need to consult preachers or the Bible. They consult their mystical feelings. And Quakers essentially are pantheism. All right, it's a belief that all is God. The Quakers, like Buddhists and Hindus and New Agers, they're pantheists. And what I said about pantheism, remember that. So Richard Foster here is, the Bible is not regarded for any guide. Really, it's only a guide for conduct and belief because they use their mystical internal experiences when they do this. And any reader of Foster's books is going to read like a who's who of, because he's going to include in them, that's what our author is saying, is the contemplative, the Catholics, and other mystical writers. And he doesn't really refer to the Bible very much at all. Therefore, these two influence, Quakerism and mystical writers, both unchristian, unscriptural. Now remember what our author is saying here. Richard Foster, Quaker, not scriptural, not Christian at all. Let's move on to another one. Another Quaker. Got another trend, right? Catholics and Quakers and Episcopal priests, but they're all mystics. Willard has been called Richard Foster's twin because of all their similar mystical beliefs. And they found themselves at the same Quaker church here in California in San Fernando Valley. The Quaker and its mystical aspects is the danger of contemplative prayer. Now let's move on to someone else here who's quite interesting. Rick Warren, mega church pastor, Saddleback Church, literally down the street from me, probably less than, 30 minutes away. And let's just look at what he does. And in his first book, very popular book, The Purpose-Driven Church, which I buy all the time in thrift stores and destroy, Warren praises a number of movements he believed God raised up. And so what does he praise? Spiritual formation. That's just another word for contemplative prayer. And who does he name in there? He names Richard Foster and Dallas Willard, two names you just saw on previous slides as leaders of the movement, and declares this movement, it has a valid message for the church. It's not Christian. It doesn't have a valid message for the church, which is another reason why Rick Warren is not to be consulted or followed in any Christian advice at all. Statements like these, as well as much other evidence, prove that Warren strongly approves of contemplative prayer. I agree with this Adventist author. No doubt he does. Now our author is going to move on to a different group here, and this is called the Emerging Church Movement. Now this book, of course, was written in 2012, and the Emergent Church movement, I think, was kind of on its downward trajectory at this point in time, but still nonetheless very influential. Dan Kimball and the guy we're going to see next, both very influential in the Emerging Church movement. But with that emerging church movement comes bad spiritual baggage like this. He further claims that the basis for learning has shifted from logic and rational to experience and mystical. We're just going to have the feelings, and that's it. Yeah, mystical. Another emerging church, and they're a very popular one too, considered a leader. You see Emerging Church. He wants to deconstruct the old and reconstruct a new kind of faith. And he, along with the other leaders and proponents in the emerging church movement essentially we're doing just that. Now, this movement has completely fallen apart now. I know it still exists, but it does not have near the power that it did when this book was authored or previous to that. And it's because it fell apart spiritually and for the mystical components that it had. Here we are again, another Catholic. Isn't this interesting? Like a mystic Catholic, and this one here is from the 16 and 1700s. A female. She was a French Catholic mystic and one of the advocates of Quietism. Now, Quietism was considered even heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, and they threw her in prison in 1695 after she published a book on this. So the Catholics didn't even like contemplative prayer and this French Catholic, and they said, no, we're not for that. We're going to jail you. So her life was devoted to mysticism and silence and contemplative prayers, and her worldviews really ended up turning into, there it is, pantheism again. She thinks God is everywhere and in all things. Now we have psychiatrist M. Scott. This guy was hugely popular. His book was popular when I was not a Christian, but I do remember the book being out on the market. So like all New Agers, Peck embraces the belief and the realization of our oneness with God and our own godhood. Do you believe that? Do you believe we are to achieve a oneness with God and our own godhood or our own divinity? And I hope not, because this guy is completely wrong. So consequently, he was impregnated with the philosophy and the worldview which he was never able to shake off from his inner mind that had become infected through this dark mystic avenue that he was pursuing of contemplative prayer and seducing spirits. So you can see our Adventist author does not have anything good to say about M. Scott Peck, and you're going to see his book here in a minute. That'll be shown later. Robert Schuller, last one we're going to show you of the sampling. Here's another theological clown. Again, about 30 minutes from my house, just going in a completely different direction, Garden Grove. Look what he wrote. Look what our author cited. It's the mediator endeavors to overcome the distraction of the conscious mind. We're going to empty our minds. And we got powers and forces, in our mind that we don't fully understand. But this last quote to me this is it. The most effective mantras, we don't do mantras in Christianity. They do in Hinduism. But look what he does. He advocates a mantra employing the sound. You can get the feel of it by repeating the word I am many times. That's a mantra. Transcendental meditation. He says it's not a religion, nor is it necessarily anti-Christian. He's not calling it TM, in other words, is, in his mind, just fine, and he advocates mantras.
Well, that was quite a list of heretical teachers, right? Don't you agree? And their backgrounds and the things that they teach, absolutely not Christian and heretical. At least two of these heretical teachers, as you saw on the previous slides, were described as having pantheistic views. I thought, well, doesn't that sound familiar in Adventism? The charge of pantheism was leveled against John Harvey Kellogg by none other than the prophetess Ellen White for his book, The Living Temple. And here is that book, I think it's 1903, first edition of that book. And then it says, and you're going to see here in a minute, this is volume 10 of the commentary set, where they have the John Harvey Kellogg, and I'm going to show you that here in a minute. Ellen White personally worked with John Harvey Kellogg and tried to get him to get rid of his pantheism, but he wouldn't. So let's just look at the account here. So here's the actual book. You can see the copyright is 1976, and that's where my source is, and it says what? He also began teaching strange doctrine in his book, The Living Temple. It was permeated with principles of pantheism. By the way, where are the page citations that I can read all these permeations of principles of pantheism in this book? I'm still waiting for that, by the way. It's just amazing. They can make the charge, but they won't even give you one single piece of evidence. Anyway, it goes on to say, Ellen G. White worked with him personally. Then in 1907, he lost his membership in the church. So, if pantheism is a really big deal, remember this. I'm going to revisit this. I'm going to revisit this charge here in Kellogg and pantheism. Keep that in your mind. Now, we only sampled 12 of the many heretical teachers that he highlighted in this very small book. I agree with his assessment. These teachers in here that he's highlighting are clearly not Christian. So let me ask you, Adventist, would you agree with him? You only saw 12. I understand you didn't read the book, but you saw 12 of them online in the actual pages from the book. So would you agree with Adventist Howard Peth and his criticisms of these pantheistic, Catholic, mystic purveyors of contemplative prayer? Would you agree with him that they're not Christian? Think before you answer. Would you agree? Now that you've made an answer in your head, what would you think, Adventist, if Seventh-day Adventists quoted favorably from some of these very authors that we just looked at? Some of these very authors who are not Christian, who are Catholic, mystic, pantheistic purveyors of contemplative prayer. Let's start here. Remember the Trappist monk, Basil Pennington. Let's start here.
All right. You remember Basil Pennington, our Trappist beer-drinking monk? All right. Which Adventist do you think like and advocate this mystic monk? Are there any Adventists who quote from him favorably? Yeah, here we go. Judd Lake. Thank you, Judd Lake, in 1996. Here it is in this Adventist Review magazine. He says, but it is also sitting down with a friend, Jesus, letting him speak to us and responding. And there's the circle. Here's the citation, Basil Pennington's helpful discussion. Yeah, so we have an Adventist quoting a contemplative prayer author. Thank you, Judd Lake, who will be a returning guy in this last part of this video. How about this one? Which Adventists like this Catholic mystic? The fact that Adventists like Catholic mystics is just absolutely comical. So who likes them? None other than, at this point in time, the president of Loma Linda University, who likes to quote from this mystic and quote from him favorably. But I'm also going to do you one more. I'm going to get you some honorable, dishonorable mentions, starting with Dwight Nelson, the retired now pastor of Pioneer Memorial Church on St. Andrew's campus, who also liked quoting this Catholic mystic, as well as this citation here. Look, published by Ave Maria Press. Gee, who's that? The Catholics. And Henry Nouwen, he died prematurely last year. Pastors everywhere lost a kindred spirit. You lost your kindred Catholic mystical spirit, didn't you? And in this last one down here, I grouped at the bottom, in this Adventist Review magazine from 2017, God enabled me, flip the equation. He's showing us where he got this from, and he's quoting favorably from, of course, this Catholic mystic. Why do Adventists like quoting all these Catholic mystics? Adventism is like a Catholic mystic religion now, isn't it? Well, let's move on to the next one. Speaking of Catholics, oh yeah, remember this guy? Which Adventists like and advocate this former Catholic priest, right? The one who was the alcoholic and got to divorce his wife, and these heretical views on the atonement. And who likes him? Oh, Dwight Nelson. Thank you, Dwight Nelson. He goes ahead and quotes Brian Manning and his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel. Then he goes on to say at the bottom here, apocryphal, he's talking about this story here. Perhaps truth? Yes. And there it is, The Ragamuffin Gospel. And of course, we got to have another dishonorable mention. And here we are here, Christian writer Brian Manning. Wow, this guy just elevated this former Catholic who doesn't have a testimony of being a Christian and calls him a Christian. That's the absurd discernment that you get in Adventism. But let's move on to the Quakers now. How about Richard Foster? Remember the Quaker mystic? They sit around and they get their feelings and etc. This guy, remember, the father of the mystical movement? He's a pantheist, right? A religion, and then a religion who doesn't uphold the Bible. Who would cite his writings in a very favorable fashion? None other than the General Conference themselves. Here in this Adventist Review General Conference issue in July of 2005, where they quote Richard Foster. Now, pantheism. Didn't Kellogg get disfellowshipped for promoting pantheism? Isn't pantheism being promoted right here, right now by the General Conference of 2005 by quoting Richard Foster? Yes, it is. You know what, General Conference, you need to be disfellowshipped, just like Kellogg was. But we got some more dishonorable mentions here. Oh, here's Judd Lake again. Yep. He's a returning guest. This guy seems to like some of the most heretical writings in existence. Popular devotional writer and lecturer Richard Foster, and he goes on to say great things about him, and he quotes him right here in his book. Adventist literature is just full of, I guess we could say, Catholic mystical writings and Quaker mystical writings, and, well, maybe perhaps emergent church mystical writings, because which Adventist is going to want to quote from this mystic emergent church leader? Well, we got a pastor here writing in Ministry Magazine from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. By the way, I read this article. This is on church growth. And they're like, what can we do to grow the church? And so you know what they do? Read with me here. We start reading. Once we knew exactly who was not attending our churches, we then went in search of current information and solid research on how to reach the group. We read books by authors such as Roger Dudley, Dan Kimball, and Brian McLaren. Emergent church. So where do they go? They go to mystical emergent church leaders to learn how to grow Adventist church. No wonder Adventism's not growing. I like this one here. Right back to the Catholics. Remember Madam here? Can you think of any Adventist that wants to quote from this French Catholic mystic who herself was rejected by the Catholics for her mysticism and contemplative prayer? Who would dare do that? Would anybody? Did I find anyone? Oh yeah, this guy right here. And this guy here too, and you're not going to see quotes by any more quotes by him, but he showed up a lot in my literature. This guy likes quoting mystical writers. Absolutely notice her. Men and women in antiquity in the 20th century of deep Christian renown. Christian renown? This lady was even thrown out of the Catholic Church for her contemplative prayer, but she's welcome into the Adventist Church. Well, how about some more dishonorable mentions? Here we go. And this is probably the oldest citation that I have. So back in 1857, they're quoting from this Catholic mystic. And even in 1882. So Adventism has a long, storied history of quoting, well, Catholic mystics. And by the way, she promoted pantheism. Now, this is all that what you see on screen here before you is all before Kellogg was thrown out in 1907 for his pantheistic views. Why isn't the editor of the Advent Review and Herald in 1857 and 1882 thrown out for their pantheistic views at that time? I guess pantheism was okay in 1857 and 1882. It wasn't okay, I guess, in 1907. What a bunch of hypocrites Seventh-day Adventists are. Let's jump to Mr. Robert Schuller here. Oh, now, surely there's been no mention of this false purveyor of anti-Christian transcendental meditation that we saw here when we read this quote on the bottom. But here we go, Ministry Magazine. I like this, and this is actually a quote not from Adventists. As you Adventists know, authors in Ministry Magazine can or cannot be Adventists. And we'll see that this one here is not an Adventist, but this is an official Seventh-day Adventist magazine offering guidance. And look at this. As the pastor of this congregation, my concern has been to create, if possible, a viable program for children and youth. So what do? We're going to go visit somebody. The board undertook their step. My wife and I were sent to Robert Schuller's Institute for Successful Church Leadership in Garden Grove, California in 1979. And they were inspired to think all the possibilities. They went and visited this transcendental meditation activist. Let's move on to the psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. Now, surely nobody will want to quote from this guy who believes, we're going to get our oneness with God and we're going to get our divinity. But you would be wrong, and none other than the editor of the Advent Review and Herald magazine, William Johnson, who actually was reading the very book our author says is absolutely heretical, which is the Road Less Traveled. And he goes on, and our author here speaks so favorably of it. But I got some more dishonorable mentions for you. Here we are in the Adventist Review magazine in February of 1987, and the Adventists are so happy they pose for a picture with this guy who's teaching you can be a little God too. Oh, this has been a really bad look for the character of Seventh-day Adventism.
So in summary, it ought to be clear by now, there is no discernment in Seventh-day Adventism. To be an Adventist is to be fed all manner of spiritual poison, such as contemplative prayer. Adventism has been feeding its members contemplative prayer authors in a variety of magazines. I didn't show you all of them, of course. I've got 138 total quotes in Adventist magazines where Adventists are citing favorably authors that this book says should not be cited. 138. Adventism is full of spiritual poison in all its magazines. You only saw a small sample. 8 of the 138 quotes I have, 8 of them are after the publication of this book. The oldest quote, which you saw in these slides before, is from 1857. The newest quote is from an Adventist magazine in 2024. I found favorable quotes of dangerous contemplative prayer authors in the Review and Herald magazine, Ministry magazine, Sabbath School Quarterly. And from these quotes come from all levels of the Adventist organization. We got the General Conference advocating contemplative prayer authors, division leaders, union leaders, senior pastors, associate pastors, elders, laypersons, SDA professors of theological seminaries, and in some cases non-Adventists who are writing in Ministry magazine but are still writing in an Adventist-approved magazine. All levels. In the beginning, I spoke favorably of this book. You heard me say I'm favorable, but I'm not recommending it. But there's another reason why I'm not going to recommend this book. Because here's what this author didn't do. How did he not know what we just saw? How did he not know Adventism has a 160-year history of citing favorably that which this author has just called critical? Yet not one page in this book cites any Adventist author critically. When I said I got 138 quotes, 8 of which are after the publication of this book. He had over 130 quotes. All he had to do was find one. Just one. Put it in the book. Say, hey, look what my church, shame on them. Not here. So let me say this, wrap it up here. Adventism is not a Christian religion, and its literature is full of non-Christian heretical poison. Even when an Adventist does a good job showing discernment, he still can't criticize his own organization for doing that which he criticizes. But there's the dual personality of Adventism. Stay out and beware of this false non-Christian Seventh-day Adventist religion.